Welcome to all of you Googlers joining us live from around the globe. And welcome to everyone else joining on our YouTube channel or listening to us on our podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Rebecca Dopp, and this is Talks at Google. Today, our guest is Jordan Shapiro. He is a multi-hyphenated and globally celebrated American thought leader. He's a PhD, a professor, a chef, a feminist, a dad, not necessarily in that order. He brings a fresh perspective combining psychology, philosophy, and economics in unexpected ways. His book, The New Childhood: Raising Kids to Thrive in a Connected World, changed the cultural conversation about parenting and screen time. In his latest book, Father Figure: How to Be a Feminist Dad, Professor Shapiro offers a norm-shattering perspective on fatherhood, family, and gender essentialism. This book is not a how-to parent book. It's much more about each individual exploring our own parenting identity as a feminist. Professor Shapiro has asked that I call him Jordan. So with that, welcome, Jordan.
Wow, thanks for having me. It's so great to be here. I'm really excited for this conversation.
We're so excited to have you. Thank you again for joining us for Talks at Google. Let me start out with this. As a parent, I really appreciate your theories because in so many ways, they invite a more productive dialogue and put the child at the center. As a society, when we're talking about mothers nursing their babies or when to get a child a device or how screen time should be discussed, we step into the traditional roles as parents, and these things for me inspire guilt and fear and panic. And the way that you talk about these things feels more accessible. Is that intentional on your part to make a more inclusive conversation that eliminates some of that parental guilt we all feel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. A lot of it is about me working through those same feelings for myself and learn and finding ways to think about them, and then hopefully offering to readers and offering to people who are watching this or listening new ways to approach old problems. I think we have a lot of scripts in our heads where we sort of come to immediate conclusions without giving a lot of thought to things. So most of the work that I do is about how to really think through complicated things that I do think, as you said, cause shame, cause guilt, cause the kinds of feelings that limit our human potential, limit the possibilities for what we imagine we can aspire to. And my hope is just to make more people feel more free and more autonomous and happier.
That's right. That's exactly right. And one of the things that you talk about in your latest book are the masks that we wear. So we put on these masks to, sort of adhere to the scripts that we're told. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the reason I use the mask metaphor is, I think we've all heard the word persona. What a lot of people don't know is that's the Latin word for mask, and it used to be the word that described the kind of masks you might see in an old drama, right? And then or it can also describe the kinds of costumes we wear for things like, we still wear a lot of costumes, even though we think we don't. In Britain, the barristers still wear their powdered wigs. We still put on wedding dresses, right? We still, when you go out to play golf, you got to put on your Under Armour shirt, right? All these things are sort of ceremonial costumes that we wear. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to say, hey, we need to be there. That's what we do. And so what I'm talking about in Father Figure is the place where we have to acknowledge how we're starting to play certain roles, wear certain masks, imagine ourselves in certain ways, and then perform certain scripts that may not be the scripts we want to perform, that may not be the scripts that are in the best interest of our families, that are in the best interest of our collective community, and certainly not in the best interest of ourselves. There's nothing really profound about this. I mean, this is most of what psychology or psychotherapy is about, right? You learn the stories that you're living into, you learn the characters that you find yourself playing, and you learn how to be more reflective and make different choices that are not automatic or not what you might do without thinking, but rather intentional and putting your own interests as the priority.
That makes complete sense. You know, when I read Father Figure, what jumped out at me almost immediately is that it's not just for dads. It's for really anyone out there who wants to be a better feminist. And I would argue you could have even titled it Human Figure. Help us understand your process.
Can you imagine a man writing a book about how to be a feminist? That'd be like the ultimate mansplaining. So I don't know that it could have been titled that. But I see your point.
But help us understand. I mean, that gives a lot of insight into it. But help us understand your process and why it's so important for you to address the fathers out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things here. One side is I really just wanted to write a feminist book for men. You know, I looked around the world. We have so much talk right now about gender. We have, we're with Me Too constantly. We have politicians and scandals, or sex scandals, gender scandals. You just hear it constantly. Gender. And what happens is men, as a whole, I think, don't know much about how to think about this. You know, I think the feminist movements have done a fantastic job of deconstructing all of these problems, of sort of breaking everything down, but haven't done a lot of saying to men, here's how to do it different. We've done a lot of going, here's what you're doing wrong, here's what you have to question. And I thought, we're starting to see a backlash now. And the backlash, I think, is coming not from men being in terrible places. I don't think there are many men who want to maintain misogynist, patriarchal inequality, at least not if you ask them directly. But they don't even understand how to interrogate their own behaviors, interrogate their own actions, look at their own ways of being and habits of mind, so that they can identify where they're doing things wrong. I thought that was really something that was missing in the feminist literature, right? The books that were really for men. There's a couple. I don't want to pretend like, I'm this amazing guy who came up with the first one, but there just really aren't many. And so I wanted to make it accessible for men to think about gender in a way that didn't feel like it was prosecutorial. Is that a word? Prosecutorial? didn't feel attacking. It didn't make them feel defensive. That made them able to go, hey, patriarchy's hurting me also, right? Patriarchy's not ideal for me as a man. And one of the reasons I did it is I wrote about it in terms of fatherhood. One, because I had been writing about parenting and I'm a parenting expert, whatever that means. So it was a reasonable place for me to enter the conversation. But also when I started writing it, I thought, patriarchy, literally, it comes from Greek, right? The patros, which means father, and arche, which means rule, or like chief, or something like that, right? Like, so it literally means rule by the father. And I thought, we need to deconstruct fatherhood if we're really going to look at what patriarchy is doing to all of us. And so that's part of what I wanted to do. I also think fathers tend to be the men who are suddenly receptive to thinking a lot more about how their behaviors impact the community.
I think that's right. And this idea where we have to, frankly, welcome the men in isn't a new idea. And feminism for a very long time was really derided in a lot of ways. And help us understand where you sit in in fighting for that. What is your definition of feminism? Because it's certainly not, in my definition, man-hating. But I think that has been, that has been assigned in certain instances to feminism.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I have still not met a feminist that would define it as man-hating. I mean, maybe there's one out there somewhere, but I've met a lot of them, and I've met a lot of the famous ones, and not one of them I think would define it as man-hating, right? Or that it's even anti-men, right? The definition I use in the book is I took from bell hooks, and it's a definition. I can't quote it directly from the top of my head, but I'll paraphrase it, which is just that feminism is a movement to resist oppression, exploitation, any kind of subjugation that's based on gender or gender stereotypes, right? One of the things I like about that definition and why I use it in Father Figure is that notice that it doesn't even mention men or women, right? It just says gender, which acknowledges that our are gender stereotypes, which absolutely put men, especially white men, at the top of a power hierarchy, right? But it's also hurting them, and it allows us to recognize that everyone is hurt by these stereotypes, and that this is not about an us versus them in any way. I'm sure as we go through this conversation, we'll get a lot more depth about that conversation. But to me, it even goes further than questions of cis hetero equality, right? I think this needs to include, just inclusivity for everyone, and the notion, whether we're talking about trans folks, whether we're talking about Islamophobia, whether we're talking about racism. I think all of that, there's sort of what's called intersectional in the feminist literature, right? That we can't really look at one place of hierarchical inequality without also acknowledging that all these other things are included. And there's ones we forget all the time, like ableism, right? The subjugation. I don't think I have enough about that in the book, for example. I've read a few books recently and I went, wow, I really didn't even mention that ableism is an issue. There's so many. We could go through a list of so many places where there's inequalities. And I think a true feminist has to at least be committed to fighting all of them. Of course, we all have to specialize in what we fight in a given moment. We can't fight everything at once, but you have to be committed to the fight for all of them.
Well, that's exactly right. And one of the things that you talk about is how the traditional vertical hierarchy sends covert and coded messages about power and agency. And I think that plays into a lot of what you were just talking about, reinforcing the idea that systemic inequality is part of the ordinary, natural, normal order of things. So tell us a little bit more about that and how those things began and started to become a part of our society.
Yeah, well, I mean, to the point you're talking about, where I mentioned that in Father Figure about the way that vertical hierarchy sends covert messages is actually in discussion of my classroom practices, because of course I teach students at Temple University, but even watching my own kids when they're in the classroom, right? You watch how they start to learn when to shut up, right? When the teacher is the authority. Now, of course, there's a place for that. I'm not trying to suggest that, classrooms should be equal. I'm a teacher. I have a job and I know more about the subject than the people I'm teaching, of course. But what happens to students, what happens to kids in the way that we construct our classrooms and where we have an expert at the front and all of them are supposed to just receive information from the expert, is they start to think that the idea that there is always an authority in every room becomes a taken for granted truth, right? So then they start looking for it in every other part of their lives, right? So who's in charge here? We hear this with people all the time. Who's the alpha here, right? Which the word alpha comes from an old study of wolves, and the person who did the study of wolves came out a few years later and said, I was wrong, there's no alpha. And yet the humans, we still want to talk about how there's an alpha all the time. But those things where we take it so for granted that there's always an alpha in the room, right? That we start looking for them. And then that becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so what I'm talking about in this book is that fathers, especially, because in all the messaging that our kids see on the media, in the books they read, on television, on the internet, in billboards, sometimes you walk through Target and there'll be a picture of a family on vacation that's got all kinds of covert, maybe unintentional, but messaging about what's the structure of that family. All of that's teaching kids that fathers are still in charge, right? The dad's the man of the house, the king of the family, right? And so fathers have to be really conscious of this. And we need to go, where are we sending these covert messages? Because we don't want them to get reproduced. We can't get rid of all of them overnight, of course, but we need to be willing to think these things through. We need to be willing to have the conversations with our kids. My kids recently told me that they were pretty sure I'm in charge, and that my wife is not in charge, and that therefore how could I write a book about feminism? And so we had to have a long talk with them about why do you think that? Please, let's talk this through. And we basically had a family meeting about this. Again, I'm not sure we convinced them. That doesn't matter. What's more is that they see that we're willing to question those things. We're not taking them for granted. So much about parenting, I think, is about that, is about showing the conversations you're willing to have versus the things that are like, the absolute laws of the family. I have some laws, right? Like no hate speech allowed in my house, right? I have some laws that you have to be kind, you have to share, you have to care, right? But then there's a lot of things that we need to be clear require questioning and require a lot of conversation.
Well, a lot of conversation and also requires some humility from the parent to apologize sometimes, right? And have that dialogue. And that's really helpful as well. And it invites that two-way conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, a lot of parents, and myself included sometimes, that becomes really hard, right? That's one of the hardest things for us to do as a parent, I think, is to relinquish the sense of authority without feeling like we're out of control, right? I am certainly responsible for my kids. I have to keep them safe. I have to make sure that they grow up into adults with good values who are going to be good to your kids, who are going to be good. I have a social, ethical responsibility to raise these into good people for everyone watching this, because my kids might interact with their kids. They have to be good people, right? Like that's my ethical responsibility. And therefore I have to have some level of leadership in their lives. But I also have to be really conscious of when I am sending messages about authority that's domineering and dominating, right? That implies that a sort of inherently violent mode of leadership. And when I say violent, I don't mean violent in the sense of punching or guns. I mean, it violates other people's agency, right? But it's violating. Right. And I have to be clear that that's not an image of maturity, that's not an image that my kids grow up with, that's not an image of I don't know, integrity that my parents, that's really, if you think back, if you think about so many of the sitcoms we might have watched from the 1950s, the kind of Leave It to Beaver sitcoms, right? There's almost this idea that there's integrity in being the father who knows best. Right. And that's ultimate integrity. And that's what I want to make sure that fathers go, hey, we definitely want to project integrity, but it's not integrity if what we're projecting is borderline misogynistic, and in some cases overtly misogynistic, patriarchal domination, right? That's not an integrity. That doesn't fit with the world we live in. That's not going to lead to success for our kids.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you talk about we now are starting to have the vocabulary to start to have these conversations in society and conversations with our kids about power and oppression and intersectionality. And one of the things that you bring up is that the words of the year for 2017, it was feminism. For 2018, it was justice. 2019, it was they. So tell us a little bit more about that and how this expansion of vocabulary, allowing us to have these conversations in the mainstream, has really been helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think we have to get into what you already said what the top words were of each year based on searches at Merriam-Webster. But I think we all know it, right? We all hear this all the time. I think this is why we're starting to see this, the backlash against wokeness, the backlash against cancel culture, is because a conversation that never happened before is starting to happen. I happen to not think that, I'm sure anyone can guess that someone who wrote a book called How to Be a Feminist Dad is not on the side of there's too much wokeness, right? But one of the reasons I think that is because that conversation, the ability to talk about those things, to do it in a nuanced, thoughtful way, is what gets us to the place where we don't have the problems happening anymore. So there won't be the calling out of people anymore, right? And that's really important. If you think about it, I'm trying to think how to make this clear, this point, right? So much of language is, so much of what allows us to change the way we are in our world, so much of what allows us to interact with people, to observe things, comes down to how sophisticated and nuanced our language is and how we talk about things and whether we have the power to talk about it. And then we're able to reflect on our own behaviors. I'll give you an example that's right in line with everything in father figure, right? We do an enormous amount in our culture of warning little girls to be careful of rapey men, right? Right. We do an enormous amount of going, be careful, don't wear that, don't walk at the dark night. We do very little. I'm sure lots of people have heard, people go, well, that, we can't blame them. That's blaming the victim. Yes, that's true. But on the other side, what I'm talking about is we do very little to give our boys sophisticated ways of thinking about their own behavior and whether their own behavior is borderline rapey. Right? How do you start to think about the nuance of what is an admittedly complicated thing, sex and intimacy? So how do you start to, as parents, give them sophisticated vocabulary?
Now, in the book, you discuss how traditional parenting roles and archetypal fatherhood are relics of the industrial age. And they get in the way of our raising, frankly, like good kids, right? Good humans. Explain what that means for the audience and why you think it's imperative for families to embrace change and discard these sort of rigid notions about gender identity.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I got to do is say to you, in fact, they're not archetypal, because archetypal would mean a kind of essential forever, right? Right, like it's always there, and they're not, right? The fact that they're of the industrial age means they're not archetypal. Actually, when I sat down to write Father Figure, I have a background in Jungian psychology, and I thought I was going to write a book about what are the essential archetypal things about fatherhood. I thought I was going to be like, this is what the father is throughout all of time, and I quickly discovered that there weren't any things like that, right? That what there was instead were these ideas about what a dad should be that were almost all industrial era. So let me give you an example of how that makes, let me just prove that to you for a second. So first of all, one of the most famous things we all think of when we think of the family is mom is supposed to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen cooking, and dad's supposed to go to work, right? That's what we're sold as, that's what it was until modern times, everything, until the feminist movement. Not true, okay? First of all, nobody went to work until the industrial age, right? The word work as a place didn't even become part of the English language. There was work as a verb, but not as a place you went to until the 20th century. Before that, everyone worked at home. You worked at the fields that were in your backyard. No one went to an office building. No one went to a factory. Everybody lived at home. Also, for most of human history, there weren't kitchens. Most of our houses were one room, right? Huts, basically. Or even when they weren't huts, they were still a single room in which you cooked and slept and ate and talked. All those things that we tend to think there was no kitchen for her to be at. Instead, everyone worked all day. The children worked all day. That's why you had children before the modern era, was so that you could have more labor on the farm, right? That's why we have our ridiculous school schedule. We all know that because we want more, because once upon a time they needed the children to work. So those idea that mom's at home in charge of the kitchen and dad's at work didn't exist until then. How did that come to be? It was because in the industrial era, we got factories and we got office buildings, and work became this sort of cold kind of business, this sort of cutthroat idea that we could separate values and old religious ideas from the work that we did. Remember, most of history, work is connected with religion, but suddenly it became, we can do work that's separate. And that's why we have phrases like, it's just business, as if we're allowed to be as unethical as possible as long as it's business, right? All that comes from the beginning of the industrial era, because they had to make it make sense to men to go to an office that was so cold and so without any warmth or family or ethics or anything. Well, in order to do that, they had to separate the human experience into two things. Home became the place for nurture, home became the place for warmth, and work became the place for cold, rational thinking. They also, at the same time, became gendered at that point, right? What happened was the men at work were supposedly tough, rational, aggressive people, and the women were innately interested in nurturing, right? That idea did not exist until the industrial era, that women were the innate nurturers. But what happens is, in order to make us believe these changes at any time in history, right? And this is what happened in the industrial era, we need to create narratives about the idea that these things are immutable, the idea that these things can't change, that they've been what's true since the beginning of time. And so we are constantly making up these origin myths that only serve to make it feel true that the current way of being is essential or archetypal. And so when I did the book, I started to go, well, if there's nothing about fatherhood that's archetypal, and what do I mean by that? What I mean is that certainly there's been, I'm not trying to say we don't need fathers. I'm not trying to say men can't parent. I'm just saying there's nothing in parenting that is gender specific, right? We tend to get all these stories that come, many of them from Freud, that the father's job is to be the tough love parent that teaches you to be rational and deal with the apathy of the real world, and the mother is supposed to hold you and care for you and nurture you, right? I have no idea if it's good or bad that those things get separated with parents. I'll let I haven't done the research to find out if that's good. But one thing I do know for sure is that there's no evidence that that's good that it's separated by gender. In fact, the evidence that it's separated by gender shows us again and again that there's no, while it may not be bad that it's separated by gender, there's certainly no benefit for it to be separated by gender. And I would argue it's bad, not from a developmental standpoint in terms of sort of neutral development, but it is starting to teach our kids things about what is innate. When a kid sees that dad is always the one who, I don't know, plans the vacation with the map, right? Gets the map, does all this, and they do all the sort of rational things in the family, then kids grow up believing that those gender divisions make sense. And we know for a fact that those gender divisions, one, are problematic for men, but even more so are problematic for little girls and for women, and absolutely for gender nonconforming and trans folk, right? Because they become invisible in a world where everything gets divided into your male or female.
That's exactly right. And it's hurtful for all involved, and those myths really cause a lot of the guilt that comes up, right? And the guilt and the shame and all of those things.
Yeah, and so from what people have told, I certainly can't speak for experience of what it's like to be a woman, but I've done a lot of research reading about it and talking to people, and what happens is they start to feel like, unless I'm that perfect nurturer, right, I'm failing as a woman. Right. I'm not just a bad mom. I'm actually, because I'm a bad mom, there's something biologically wrong with me. I'm not living up to my biological category. Right. So that creates an enormous amount of shame for mothers. Right. For teenage girls, for example, if they don't have the attitude towards sex that they see constantly on television or in the movies, if they don't feel that way, then they feel like they are failing. There's something wrong. Right. That becomes pathologized in their mind. And that's a sense of shame and self-loathing. For men, what we don't talk about a lot is how this hurts men, okay? For men, this idea, which I was just talking about, that there is an alpha, for example, or the leadership, or any of these ideas around what it means to be a man, right? Or what it means to be a dad or father knows best. They're impossible to achieve. There are some researchers who call it impossible masculinity, right? It is impossible to be the alpha in every part of your life, right? Doesn't matter who you are, right? Maybe you're the alpha. First of all, there's no such thing as alpha. But if there were, if you're the alpha in your own family, then you're probably not at work. And if you are the boss at work, then guess what? Everyone always has a boss, right? There's always the next one. And so what happens, because you never feel like you're the king of the hill, you never feel like you're outperforming everyone, you never feel like every woman wants you, you never feel like I have the best car, you never feel like it's the men who move through their lives feeling like they're failing to be men. Right. And so they're full of this shame of their inability to live up to the masculine ideals. Right. And we see this even in super famous men who, like, if anyone makes fun of them, they're suddenly hurt. They're not strong. They're like, dang, they're because they live with imposter syndrome. They live with this idea that I'm afraid I'm not living up to the ideal that everyone tells me I'm supposed to be. Well, this leads to a terrible loop of shame for men. Almost every man is moving through their lives feeling like they're failing to do that. And because of that, they end up compensating in you know, the least problematic cases, they compensate just by sort of being assholes. Right, that's the mansplaining, that's the gaslighting, right. I have a line in Father Figure where I say, men mansplain where they can, because in most of their lives they can't. Right, most of their lives, you can't walk into a business meeting with the CEO of your company and mansplain. You have to be subservient and close your mouth. Right, so when they get home and they're like, now I'm going to tell you because you're not going to. So that becomes a compensation, and then in the worst case scenarios, that becomes actual physical or sexual abuse, right? Or this sense of entitlement, this sense of, you know, or in some of the cases we've all heard about, these stories of these stories of incels who the shooter, I can't remember where it was now, but the shooter who felt so entitled to sex that he compensated by killing people. I mean, we have these terrible tragedies of stories like this, and all of this is because of patriarchal expectation, the masks that we're told to wear as men that we cannot wear, right? They won't work, right? And it's becoming more of a problem because again, these masks, men are told, boys are told all the time, these masks, these roles that you play, this idea of aspirational masculinity is going to give you success, is going to give you power, is going to give you status. But then we have a world that is increasingly dependent on things that have for a long time been associated with femininity, right? Communication, the ability to be vulnerable, right? Every corporate job you better learn how to speak in the so-called woke language, or you're going to get fired. You better communicate. So it's actually doing the exact opposite, where men trying to do what we think of as traditional masculinity, even though it's really just industrial age masculinity, right? Men trying to do that are finding they have less power because of it. And therefore that's part of why we're getting the backlash now. So what dads need to do is start teaching our kids now, like, forget these categories of male behaviors and female behaviors. Don't be a man, whatever that means. Instead, be yourself and learn how to do the things that industry depends on, that everything depends on, that success now depends on. We're a communication society now. We're no longer a muscle society.
That's exactly right. In what seemed to be an epiphany for you, you were told, and this was one of my favorite stories in the book, that we're all in colliding myths. So I don't understand why you would expect them to see you as the hero when that's obviously not your role in any of their stories. And I reread that story a few times because I just think it's such an important concept to remember, not just when we're humaning with our family members, but really humaning with anyone. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Wait, you said humaning?
Yes, when we're in our relationships with our family, when we're in our relationships at work, when we're being good humans, right?
I like that.
It's just such a good way to think about it, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I can't take credit for it. It's something that a psychoanalyst once said to me when I was in psychoanalysis. But it was huge for me, which is why I'm writing about it. Probably a decade or two later. It's always in the back of my mind. Yeah, we're all in colliding myths, and I think I'd even argue. I'd have to think a little bit more, but I think I'd argue that 99% of our relationship problems, whether that's romantic relationships, whether that's child-parent relationships, whether that's work relationships, 99% of those problems come because we are upset that someone else is ruining our story, right? Like, why didn't you follow that? Right? Like, why didn't you go with the script, right? I thought I was the hero. I was moving through the story. I thought I was Luke Skywalker. I thought I was going to win the whole journey, and you just came in and interrupted it, and I'm mad at you. But what we forget is that everyone else also believes they're the hero of their own story, which means in some stories, you're someone else's mentor. In some stories, you're someone else's villain. I'm often my kid's villain, right? I got to accept that, right? But it's hard because in my head, I'm the hero of the story, trying to be the perfect parent who's trying to succeed at this thing called life. But for my kids, I'm just the evil villain, or I'm just the mentor. I'm just the troll under the bridge that won't let them go out with their friends unless they can answer the riddle. You know, like that's reality. And we're all doing that with all the people that we interact with. And we need to remember it. By the way, I think this is part of the reason that men have such trouble with feminism. Right, is that men, especially in a patriarchy and in our patriarchy, are taught that they have the right to be the center of the story. Right, almost every movie is still about a white male protagonist. Yes, there are a few examples otherwise, but still the majority is that. Most of what they say, it's your story, it's your world, you move through it. They may not believe that on an intellectual level, but because they've been socialized in a world that says that over and over again, on some unconscious level, you believe that you are the center of your own story. And we are on some level all the center of our own story. So what happens when suddenly you turn on the TV and you're watching Rachel Maddow and you find out that you're also a villain in an entire gender story, right? Well, what happens is men go, wait, I've been trying to do what's right. I've tried to be ethical. I've tried to be the hero. I've tried to do so good. Now you're telling me I'm the villain. And they can't reconcile the tension between how can I both have done everything in my life to try to be a good guy and also have all these people saying that I'm Darth Vader. Right? How can both those things be true at once? And the fact is, it's actually true at once for everyone all the time, that you are simultaneously the hero and somewhere else the villain, somewhere else the mentor. I mean, I could think of some others. You know, and the fact is sometimes you're not, you know, you got to take the gender out of these mythological tropes too, because sometimes you're the princess, even if that doesn't fit the normative way of thinking about cisgender categories.
That's exactly right. And I think that that's such an important lesson to teach our kids as they're going through life. Now we're going to take some questions from Googlers, but before we go there, I would be remiss if we didn't touch just for a few moments on your first book, The New Childhood, which explores how to raise kids in our current age with the technology all around us. And your thoughts in some circles have been pretty controversial and challenged. Tell us a little bit more about why screen time isn't all that bad.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if well, let's put it this way. Is screen time bad? No, there's 100 years of doctors and researchers, at least 100 years since the beginning of television, trying to prove that screen time is toxic. Right. My mom used to be like, don't sit too close to the screen. Right. It'll ruin your eyes. Don't watch too much TV. It'll rot your brain. None of those things are true. Right. They've spent 100 years trying to prove that they are. There is no toxic impact from exposure to screens. That being said, that doesn't mean sitting in front of a screen all day is a good thing either, right? It just means, right? It just means it's not necessarily hurting you. So what I was trying to do in The New Childhood is to say to parents, look, the question isn't how much time they're on the screen. The question is, what are they doing and how are they making sense of the time they spend on the screen? You know, how do I help you make meaning out of the things you see on the screen? One of the problems, the biggest problem, and I'm very worried about kids and screens, but not the screen itself, right? I know that my kids watch a ton of YouTube videos. I worry, are those YouTube videos going to radicalize them? Are they going to find some like that fall down some like alt-right rabbit hole that's going to make them start to think crazy ideas? And so what I have to do is to mentor them so that they can make meaning and reflect on the things that they're exposed to on the screen. That's always been the job of parents, right? You know, parents have always, from the very beginning, people have worried about new technologies, and we're not getting rid of screens. I think we know that, right? I mean, we're all going to have smartphones for a long time. We're all going to have screens. So the question that parents need to engage in now, and by the way, in saying that, I'm not saying we don't also have to ask some much larger questions about legislation and policy and how we think about screens in terms of a collective. But for parents, which is all I'm talking about right now, what we need to do is go, how do we prepare our kids to live in a world of screens so that they can leverage all the benefits of screens without falling prey to the potential problems that come from screens?
I think that makes complete sense. And it takes a lot of the pressure off of us parents. And, you know, you wrote that book book prior to the pandemic. And I'm wondering if some of the dialogue and the conversation about the concepts and the theories in that book have evolved over time, since we've all really been trying to teach our kids, and the kids are frankly in front of screens all day long, and that's how they've been going to school the past year and a half. Has anything changed or evolved since you wrote that book?
I mean, certainly there has been a lot of research about how kids' screen use and the relationship between parents and screens. Parents and kids and screen time manifested during pandemic lockdown. And there are certainly changes there, in the sense that parents have gotten much more relaxed about some of the limits. I think parents have started to see that this is not about escape as much as social connection, which is one of the things I talked about in The New Childhood a lot, right? We have the image of the gamer in his basement playing, like, we still imagine it's Atari and it's like not talking to anyone, when actually almost everything they're playing is super social with lots of people and tons of people around them. So in that sense, I think there's some change to the attitude, but I think we still see a lot of the same assumptions that are not grounded in real research, right? Ideas about the idea, there have been a lot of studies trying to say that phones and social media cause depression and suicide, and there's really no evidence to point to that. There is certainly evidence that there's a spike in depression and a spike in suicide, but it actually started before smartphones, but it is going up. But we have, there's so many other things in the world: climate change, rising authoritarianism, tribalism, right?
That's right.
There's like, how do we can't just decide that one correlation makes sense. So in that, but we still want to fall back to blaming those things. We still want to fall back to blaming this technology that's scary. And one of the reasons it's so scary, just to connect both of these conversations about both books, is it disrupts those industrial age divisions between male work and female nurturing, right? Like, we don't like the idea that our kids are sitting at home and the picket fence around our house. I bet most of us don't have picket fences, but I mean it metaphorically, right? The picket fence around our house doesn't hold our kids in, right? They could be sitting right next to us on the sofa and be talking to someone in the Ukraine, right? And that's right. Scary, and that disrupts our way of thinking about what family is and what home is and what child rearing is and what gender is, right? And so there's a ton of resistance to that, because and we still see it, and that really hasn't changed. I'm hoping it'll start to, just like I'm hoping everything we learned about the way that domestic labor in the household is inequitable, even though we all knew it before, even though, let's put it, the research was already clear long before the pandemic. I'm hoping that the pandemic pushes it more to the tip of our tongues, so that we start to have the conversations we need to have to make changes.
I think that's exactly right. Okay. So let's go to questions from Googlers. Neither one of us have seen these questions. Okay, so here's the first one from Sam Horner. There's a generational gap with the vocab and behaviors we use with our kids versus that of our parents. What advice do you have for educating older generations on the modern guidance around these topics?
Oh,
thanks,
my God. I love this question. And I'll tell you why. I'm going to give that for two reasons. One, before I even wrote Father Figure, one of the things that made me want to write Father Figure was I was sitting at dinner with my two biological children, and I said something about one of their friends, and they said, "Dad, you used the wrong pronoun." And I said something back, and they started to be like, "Dad, why are you saying they with such force? Like, it's a big deal. Don't." And I was like, I got so mad. Like, inside my head, I was like, "I taught you to be a feminist. How dare you correct my pronoun?" And as I'm going through that, I go, wait a second. If I'm feeling defensive about this, and I studied critical gender theory, right? And I study feminism, and I teach it in the classroom, and I'm feeling defensive when I'm correcting by my kids. What is it like for someone who doesn't study these things, who does not feel confident in their ability to think about it? And that was part of why I wanted to write the book, because I wanted to help dads be able to have the confidence to have these these discussions. The other story I want to tell is when I gave when I first finished the book, I gave it to my own dad to read because I was like, this is, by the way, that was one of the scariest moments of my life. But I was like, you better read this before it gets published because I don't know how you're going to feel about it. But I remember him going back and going, there were words in it that he didn't know because it was what you'll hear people call the woke language, right? Which they usually mean in a derogatory way. He just didn't know it. I'm a college professor. I'm in the classroom with these kids all the time. I hear it. So I did have to put some places in the book where I clarified it because I realized it wasn't common sense. The bottom line is there's a generational gap in terms of language, but there's not a generational gap in terms of empathy. And I think there's a lot of us who are afraid of using the wrong words because we think we're going to be criticized and we think we're going to be corrected. Yeah, you're going to be criticized and they're going to think you're wrong. Your kids are going to think you're wrong anyway once they become teenagers, trust me. So just get over it now. And don't be afraid to say, oh, I don't understand what that means. Please explain it to me. This is true. This is true. I mean, this is one of the things I had to learn as a professor in the classroom is that when students correct me about things like pronouns or gender, that I have to have the level of humility to be able to say, I'm sorry, my goal is not to offend anyone. I'm always trying to make it as equal and open for everyone. So please teach me how to do this in a way that's better for you. I have never had anyone who said, I'm going to cancel you because you used the wrong word, because I followed up when I used the wrong word with, I'm so sorry, I wouldn't have done that had I known, and please teach me so I can't do it again.
I think that's great. Next question. All right, this comes from Michelle Ankerlin. What were the biggest learnings you had from observing the father figures you grew up with? You were just talking a little bit about your father.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough question because there's both the positive learnings and the negative learnings, right? And when we talk about father figures, there's both my own father, there's bosses that I had when I was a teenager, there's teachers, there's coaches, and I had to both see the positive and the negative, and thinking about it. One of the hard things about the book when I was just talking about showing it to my own dad was getting to that point where I could go, just because I'm suggesting that things need to be different than the way that my father did it, doesn't mean I'm saying that my father did it wrong, right? And being able to say that at once, right? I think my father did the best he could in the context in which he lived and with the knowledge that he had. I think he was as feminist as he could be in the context in which he lived and with the knowledge that he had. Not good enough for this moment in time, right? And that's not necessarily a criticism of him. That's just an acknowledgement that I have to do it different. But there's a lot of things he did great, and that's what I talk about a lot of them in the book. I talk about both the positives and the negatives. I talk about the places where I screw up, and the biggest learnings are learning how to really be, the term I use in the book is a responsive parent, right? To respond to the context, to respond to the kids, to respond to what's going on around you with a level of compassion and a level of love and a level of acknowledging the colliding myths, all of those things that let you move forward in a way that puts you in the present of the relationship, or to use your word, Rebecca, humaning, that allows you to be humaning with your kids. And again, when I say I'm certainly a little bit hippie and super progressive and all of that, but I'm not one of those people who's like, it should be equal. I'm not, and believe me, you ask my kids, they'll be like, what? He yells at us? He does not believe that. This is not like, let kids be free, right? I'm still the leader, but I have to lead with this sense of respect, understanding, and deep listening, where I'm not defining their experience, but rather mentoring them through their own experience. I'm the Sherpa, I'm the guide, I'm not the definer. I don't get to define their reality. But it is my job to make sure they thrive in their reality. And sometimes that means saying, screaming no, right? Right. In the most obvious places, when they run across the street and there's traffic coming, you scream no, and you make the kids stop and you scare them into stopping. But that's not the same as saying, I'm going to define how you're allowed to think about where you go.
Right. That's exactly right. And making sure that they understand that they have agency, right?
Yeah,
in their own experience.
Agency and dignity, right? And dignity is really, we don't, a lot of kids, we don't allow them dignity, and dignity comes from the ability to see yourself as an agent with autonomy. And by the way, autonomy comes from the same root as authority, right? Autos, which is Greek. It means self. It means being self-fulfilled in some ways, or being able, being, we say an automobile is a carriage that drives itself without a horse, right? It drives itself. But that's what we have to do. We have to allow kids to drive themselves and to move their own stories forward. And our job is to make sure they're safe, and to make sure they thrive, and to make sure they get the most out of it for what they need, right? Not to decide what they need, not to decide what their story is. And that's a hard thing to do. That's what makes parenting so difficult. And I'm be the first one to say it's an unbelievable difficult job. I'm not sure if I could go back. I'm not sure I'd do it again. It's so hard. Right? And one of the reasons it's hard is because you have to somehow allow them that agency, and allow them that freedom and that dignity, and know when it's time to step in without stepping on their story. Right. And that's always, I can't, many nights I go to sleep, and the first thing I think while lying in bed awake is, I really screwed up today. I didn't, I did this wrong. I did not give my kids that. And, sometimes I have the humility to walk up to my kids and go, can I talk about yesterday? I made a mistake. And sometimes I just pretend it didn't happen and don't talk about it.
But I love that concept of dignity, and it's you made me think about it in a way that I haven't thought about it before. So I thank you, and thank Michelle for the great question. I think we have one more question. Yes, here we go, from Kate Waldwick. There is often, even in more progressive households, an imbalance in the emotional labor and household project management expected of women. I love this question. It's right on. How can we encourage boys to take on the emotional labor? And I love this project management concept. The thought, all of the things that are stored in our head that we are required to keep the household moving.
Yeah, so this is it's a great question, and of course there's a great book by Eve Rodsky called Fair Play that's all about the way that this works. But the first thing I want to say is I like the term project management more than emotional labor, because I think that term emotional labor is part of how we continue to put it on women by pretending it's emotional and then pretending that women are more emotional. It's not emotional labor. It's about being able to manage the logistics of the household. There's nothing emotional about it. We call it emotional to pretend that it's motivated by a deep feminine desire to nurture, right? Some feeling that women have that makes them want to plan soccer, make sure everyone has the right shoes for soccer, and plan the birthday parties, and make sure that the pediatrician's appointments happen, and all the logistics of their lives. There's nothing emotional about that. That is project management. So I love that the question said project management. And again, there's nothing, even in our normal gendered categories, all those things are the kind of logistical things that we often say men are better at, right? Which is not true, right? But when it comes to family, apparently men stink at it, right? Or laundry. Laundry is one that never made any, laundry is the easiest thing in the world to do. You put it in and you press, there's no secrets. There's no how do you go, how could someone be good at it, right? You pour soap in and you press the button. Anyway, there's all these things that women have to think about, right? How do I make sure the clothes are clean in time for school tomorrow? They're going on in the back of their heads in order to manage the family. And all the research has shown time and again that this is completely disproportional, even with families where the men are proudly progressive, even if they identify as feminists, even if they're like me, right? When they do the real research of their time, what they find is that almost nothing has changed in the distribution of the labor in the family. So the first thing I encourage, one, we do this in my family with my partner, Amanda, is keep score, Okay, I know everybody says don't keep score in relationships. I'm pretty sure that's patriarchal propaganda, right? Because if you don't keep score, guess what? That's like when you have a business, if there's not a budget line for it, nobody thinks about it, right? So I'm like, keep score, write down, make sure you're valuing everything that gets done. And because if you don't keep score, I guarantee you it's always going to tilt towards the husband, because that's how the TV tells us it's supposed to be. That's how everything tells us it's supposed to be. So keep score, discuss those things. It doesn't matter who does the laundry. It doesn't matter who cooks. These are not gendered things. What matters is that that's valued, and that's distributed not according to your genitals, because there's nothing about your genitals that makes you better at cooking or cleaning, but according to who's better at it. I do all the cooking in my house. I don't even let my wife near the kitchen. And why? One, because I was a professional chef. It's easy for me. We have 6 of us in the house. It would be absurd for her to try to cook for 6 people and have it ready on the table. Would be a lot of work. For me, it's nothing, because I used to do it for 600 people, right? And this is just distributing that labor according to skill set, not according to genitals. Ask yourself why someone does everything in your family. Why is one person doing one or the other? And make sure it's because they either want to, or they're better at it, or it's more convenient, or they agreed to it. There's lots of things no one wants. I don't think anyone wants to clean the toilets, right? But who does it more often, right? That's the question. And why? Is there a reason beyond assumed gender roles? And if there's not, then you better have a long discussion about what you're going to do that's also a terrible job in order to equalize the labor in the family. That's a hard one to fix. And I noticed the questioner used the word, how do we teach our boys? And that's important too, right? That you're teaching that with boys. In fact, what they have found in research is that families with all sons, for example, or all kids who identify as male, tend to actually have less of those gender roles than families that have mixed siblings, right? Because what happens in a family with mixed gender siblings is we tend to easily fall back on, why don't we have the daughter do the dishes and the son mow the lawn? Right. And so those things start to get socialized and become normalized in your family, where when it's all sons, then someone's got to do the dishes and they don't think of it as someone's job. So I would encourage mixing some of that up. I would encourage, looking at those things. And especially if you have mixed genders among your children, watching for the places, especially where daughters are already starting to believe they're responsible for the so-called emotional labor. I've seen that with my stepdaughter, where she already thinks it's her job to relinquish certain privileges in order to caretake for her brothers. And I'm like, no, don't help. Right? Like, you don't have to do it for him. Like he should do it. He's being lazy, right? So watching for those things, because they're hard, because what happens is it seems so kind. When you have a little 7-year-old girl go, it's okay, I would like to give my dessert to my brother, right? Like that feels so nice, and you don't want to disrupt it, but you also have to ask yourself, is that just kindness, or is it because they think that the brother is more entitled to it?
Right. Well, and that translates when they get older and enter the workforce, and you're in business, and the women seem to be the scribes, and the women are the ones that say, do you have a water? Do you want me to get you a water? And it really comes out in those ways. And I think that we could all do better.
Yeah. And I would say, that's why I think, going back to your very, very first question, that's part of why I think this book, Father Figure, is so, as you said, it could be human figure, because it's not really about how to be a man or how to be a man as a feminist, as much as explaining the way that the behavior or ideas or images that we imagine to go with masculinity are harmful to all of us. I've had so many women read the book and say to me, you know what, this made me actually understand and forgive my own father for a lot of stuff. This made me realize some of what my husband is going through and not just be angry. And in that sense, I think that makes me happy. I didn't know that was going to happen when I wrote the book, but I think that's the point. And then that can translate into a business setting where you start to realize we reproduce so many of these family assumptions. That's why we say things like my office wife, right? That might be something that anyone who works in office should think about right now. If someone says you have an office wife or an office husband, right, that's not just because of your intimate relationship. That's also probably because of power dynamics. So time to ask what that looks like.
Right. I love that. Okay, so we are at time. I have one final question for you.
Okay.
And that is, what is one thing that we can all do today to start to have these long overdue conversations about power and oppression and intersectionality?
I mean, the one thing is you would go read Father Figure, but I don't think that's what you're asking. No, I mean, I think the one thing I think everybody should do is look for the things that you take for granted. Almost always hiding in the things we take for granted are power agendas. Almost always. Anytime I hear someone go, "We're hardwired to be X," the hair on the back of my neck goes up and goes, one, there's no wires in our mind. Okay, right? That metaphor that's a metaphor, and that's a metaphor that is trying to tell us that something about our cultural behavior can't be changed, is fixed, and there is nothing about human psychology or culture that is fixed. Anytime someone tells you it is fixed, they are trying to argue that the current dynamics of power need to stay how they are, probably because they're benefiting from it in some way, or it's serving them in some way. And it might be serving them in the way, I want to clarify that one way, because often we'll even hear oppressed people trying to reinforce things that are taken for granted, that are not in their own interest, because actually it's easier to go through the world without ruffling feathers, without having to change, without having to look at how your entire identity has been constructed in an unequal power dynamic, than it is to fight it. And so that would be my one thing. Anytime there's something you think of as normal, anytime there's something you think of as how it's always been, and I feel like I could build my whole career just on writing books about things that we think are how they've always been that aren't. Because almost everything we believe is how it's always been is not how it's always been. It's just the way that we, again, as I said earlier, it's the origin story we tell to make the current feel essential and eternal.
Right. Well, listen, Sam, Michelle, and Kate, thank you for your questions. Thank you to all of you who have joined us today. And Jordan Shapiro, thank you so much. It's been such an honor to have you here, and we're really appreciative that you joined us at Talks at Google.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all the Googlers.